Welcome Internet to this video on the use and misuse of silence in psychotherapy. Before we begin, I just need to say that these are only my perspectives on the topic and not a general or universal truth. And everyone has the right and is entitled to their own perspective and opinion, and I'm not impeding on that. I'm just giving my version of it. So, about silence. Silence is one of those interesting tools in psychotherapy that has fallen into quite disrepute because a lot of people find it almost offensive that the therapist remains silent. And I find that very interesting because silence is, I think, essential in psychotherapy, at least on the part of the therapist. Why so? Well, basically because silence allows for the patient to deploy and to move into the history, to really feel the weight of their words. That it's not just something that is like just talking to a wall. It's really investing one's use of the language. And I find that to be essential. Because if one cannot carry their discourse, then they might be more at unease about speaking. They might not be able to verbalize everything they have on their hearts. And as such, as a therapist and as a psychologist, I think it's so important for the patient to be able to talk and to be able to be this focus of the session, of the psychotherapy. And the silence of the therapist helps that. And it helps the patient be able to take up the space, a space that some people have never been able to invest or never have been given. So that's why it's so important to sometimes remain silent. It's also important because sometimes the silence of the therapist is going to allow the patient to be able to think, to reflect on what has been said, on the real wording of what they've talked about. And sometimes this silence is very fertile. In French we have an expression that says une pause féconde, to show that a silence can be in a way transformative and even creative as you reflect on what has just been said. It's also a moment of ability to go into deep, insightful understanding. That if the therapist is to speak at that moment, that might basically hurt this ability to self-reflect of the patient, which is in a way counterproductive, because it is the whole point of psychotherapy is to facilitate this inner introspection that cannot happen if, for example, the therapist and the patient are always talking. So silence definitely has its role and its place in the session, and I think it's so important to not let modernity take over everything, that everything has to be filled and fulfilled. Silence is in a way a moment in which both parties can be with their thoughts, alone with their thoughts, and this is so productive because not every moment has to be interactional in the session. Some moments can just be looking at one's own subjectivity, and here I'm talking about both the patient and the therapist, right? I'm not saying that the therapist isn't looking inwards in those moments. And I think that they're so very important, and that's why also I wanted to make this video, to be able to talk about those important moments, that sometimes insights come with silence, that silence isn't a deadness in the session, it is a moment of life and of potential birth of something, be it a realization, an understanding, or even an association, rethinking about something, connecting two ideas together. So important, and it can only happen if there is room for it to happen. And as I was saying earlier, not every patient throughout their lives were given the room to talk, the room to speak, and to have their own voice. And therefore this silence is there to help them be able to invest the room, the space, and to be able to make something out of it, and to also trust their own ability to hold a conversation, to hold a perspective without being contradicted, without being mystified or gaslighted. That their words are almost sacred in a way and important. And this, I think, is granted by silence, the silence of the therapist. Now that I've talked about all the benefits of silence, I also have to now speak about its misusage. Because the problem with silence is that it's only as good as the strength of the relationship. And if the patient, for example, like at the very start of psychotherapy, does not know how it works, silence might seem as a form of abandonment of the therapist. The therapist is detaching himself, uncaring, uninvested, and it might be felt by patients as a form of like letting go, a form of like just uncaringness, which it is not, but it might be experienced or lived like that. Therefore, some patients might need, at least at the beginning, for the therapist to be talking, to be interacting. And I must admit that I am myself more of a talkative therapist, but I do know that it's still the role of the patient to take their place, and my silence is essential, especially in important moments. Therefore, for example, and this is only in my case, it's the patient that's going to do 80% of the talking, and I'm going to just remain silent. And I think it's important because it's a moment where they can basically reflect. But if that silence is too present, that might inhibit the patient. The patient might feel that they're talking to a wall or someone that doesn't care. Therefore, it's always important to have this dialectic. But sometimes certain therapists can, I think, go too far with silence, that they can really just refuse to talk and let the associations of the patient just completely roll on their own. And I think that this can only be done if the patient is very, very well aware of psychoanalysis and the rules of psychoanalysis. Because if they're not, this might be a brutal introduction. It might not be what they expect in a therapist, because a lot of patients are expecting therapists that might give them advice or that might guide them. And having complete silence might inhibit the transference from happening. Because contrary to what one thinks, it's not because the therapist talks that it prevents a patient from projecting. Because the patient is always going to project regardless of what happens, right? And same for the therapist. The therapist is always going to project some sense on the patient. Likewise, I mean, it goes both ways. But in the case of an absolute silence, it might be complicated for the patient to deal with. So it might be very hard at the beginning if the patient is unaware of the way things are meant to go, right? Also, I would say that sometimes the silence of the therapist is also a form of resistance. For example, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it sometimes is like a withdrawal of the relationship or a deep uncertainty on how to respond, how to think, or how to present things to the patient. Sometimes it's also necessary for the therapist and the patient to be silent. Like, for example, if something very heavy has been said and needs a certain time to in a way land for both parties, so it can be very important in this regard. It can also be very essential for the silence to be respected at certain points, and the therapist to be able to leave a space for the patient. But as Kohut notes, and this is, I think, very important, is that silence, if, for example, a patient asks a question to the therapist, remaining silent isn't a technique, isn't like good psychoanalytic practice. That's just impolite. Someone has asked you a question, not answering. It means that in a way you're withdrawing yourself from the relationship, and you're even saying that you're not even going to entertain any idea of a relationship. And when I mean answer, let's get this very clear, very straight. I am not talking about like disclosing your life if it's inappropriate or if it's not going to help the patient, or even disclosing if there's no interest in that or if it's not your technique. What I'm saying is that not answering by, listen, I don't think it's going to help you, I don't think it's going to achieve anything to answer this question, is an answer. Because answering is not disclosing, all right? There's a two different things. Also, and this is important, sometimes silence can be seen as a form of retaliation. That the patient might think that they have attacked the therapist and that the therapist has been destroyed, quote unquote, by the fact that they remain silent. And might also be seen, for example, in certain forms of malignant narcissism, as silence might be seen as condoning certain actions, like, well, he didn't say anything about when I, for example, inventing here, but the therapist didn't say anything when, for example, I robbed my wife. So that's okay. It's okay. It's our secret. So silence is not always the right way to go. And this is, I want to make this very clear, that I am not for this vow of never talking. That, I think, is not good for the patient, nor for the therapist, and for the therapeutic progress of the patient. I think that there is not even a middle ground, but there's a nice balance between letting the words of the patient flow and being able to interrupt or add something. And I think that in the natural flow of conversation, because this is in the end what therapy is, it's a conversation that aims to give insights. Silence is a good thing. Silence is productive. It's, in a way, it's the, if you forgive the metaphor, it's a form of pregnancy of something. Something is going to be born through the silence, or with the silence. Silence can also be enjoyable as a moment of respite, of relaxation of both parties. So silence is inherently a good thing, but it cannot be massive, it cannot be absolute. It has to be, in a way, kept in check. And that's what Raka, for example, in his book on transference and countertransference explains, is that sometimes silence is a resistance of the analyst towards the patient, a resistance to countertransferential emotions, or even sometimes pseudo-transference. And as Kohut explains it, it's impolite. He explains it in the analysis of the self. That when someone asks you something, when you don't answer, that's just being rude. And I think that's very true. Again, answering not being disclosing everything or answering every demand the patient has, but giving an answer, i.e. being present in the relationship. And when the presence of the therapist makes no doubt for the patient, then his silence isn't seen as an absence or as an abandonment, but quite the opposite, as a presence. As a deep presence that doesn't even need words. And that is the best case scenario. A moment where the patient can just basically speak and exert his influence and his being into the world. And I think that that's the best, when basically the silence of the therapist is at its best use. It's when the patient deploys who he truly is. And that's wonderful. And it's my opinion, my professional opinion, that it could not be done if the therapist was talking all the time or giving answers or advice all the time. It needs the patient's basically expression and the deep withdrawal of the voice of the therapist for the patient to have his voice at certain moments. So anyway, I hope you found this video interesting on the use and misuse of silence in psychotherapy. If you have any questions, because remember, this is only my opinion, it's not truth, feel free to put them in the comments. If you want to have a conversation, I'll be glad to have one. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.